Hello everyone, welcome to the problem solving section 8 of conservation geography and of course offered by NPTEL, and we will continue our discussion from the previous session. So in this session, the module that was covered was conservation of biodiversity, and the lectures that were covered in this week was threats to species, ex situ and in situ conservation, and benefits from conservation. So let's first start with the first lecture, which is threats to species. Now, we have discussed about push and pull factors previously. Now, what are push factors and what are pull factors? We basically name these factors with respect to the presence of biodiversity or organisms or animals or plants. So anything that attracts the animals or plants to like to be in that region are basically pull factor, because they're pulling them pulling the biodiversity towards themselves. If it, you can think in terms of animal movement, so these factors enable the movement of animal from one place to the other, while push factors are those factors that make the habitat or the environment unsuitable for the animals. So basically they move the animals away from those, so they push the animals out. So these are important because we are now talking about threats to species, and threats are basically what do we see or what do we think when we say threats to species? Something which is like creating problem for their survival or for their habitation. So they are also push factors. So before we move to threats, we first need to understand what are push and pull factors. So as you can see on the slide, pull factors are those factors that when animals are moving from place A to place B, the factors place B have that attract the animals are called the pull factors, while when the animals are moving from place site A or site B, then the factors that push the animals away from site A are called the push factors. Examples of push and pull factors are, for example, pull factors can be good climate, plenty of food and water, and absence of predators. While push factors, the ones that move animals out, are like bad climate, the opposite of pull factor basically. So shortage of food or presence of a lot of predators, presence of parasites and disease. So if an animal senses there are a lot of predators in this region, they will move out of that region, and that is a threat. That is also perceived as a threat. Like the predator or the disease or shortage of food is basically something that leads to their decimation of their population. Right. So threats to biodiversity are mainly classified as these 5 causes. So they can be, so the first one is pollution of air, water, and land. Second is habitat loss, degradation, or destruction, anything to do with habitat, related issues. Third is overexploitation of land, for example, overfishing, hunting, farming. Fourth is invasive species, which is being introduced into a foreign habitat, which can bring along with itself some diseases, and it can also cause problem for the native flora and fauna. And fifth is the climate change, for example, extreme weather and rising sea level and ocean acidification. And we have discussed all of these in the previous session, so we do know, or we do have an idea about how these different causes affect the biodiversity loss. Now, when you talk about push factors, we can classify them in two categories. We can say one of them as declining population paradigm and the other as small population paradigm. Now, push factors are factors that move the animals out of a region. Yes, they do. Now, but these factors can themselves be divided into two effects or two paradigms, basically two classes, depending on what they are affecting and how they are, when they are affecting the population. So factors that will fall under the first one, which is declining population paradigm, are basically those factors that bring a decline in the population number. So these factors push the population towards reduction in their sizes. Right now, once the population is being reduced in sizes, it will reach to a level which is called small population, which is extremely small population. When in those populations further factors will play upon, those are called small population paradigms. Those are the factors that affect on these small population. So let's describe them in more detail. So the first one is declining population paradigm, which talks about the factors that push the population towards smaller numbers through population dynamics. While the second one, which is small population paradigm, it talks about the factors that push a small population towards extinction, because from a larger population size you can come to a smaller population size, but when you are experiencing push factor on a small population, then the ultimate level is about extinction. You go extinct because of those factors. So the declining population paradigm, they are affected by habitat destruction, competition, overexploitation. So all these different factors, habitat destruction, competition, overexploitation, they decimate the population size. While when you come to small population paradigm, these are mediated by alley effects and stochastic depth. So these are effects which impact, which have great, which are also there in larger size, of course, yes, but they have greater impact when they are, when they're acting on the small population. And if they are, if there is too small a population, it can even lead to extinction of those animals. So I'm sorry, yeah. So let's begin with the first one. So so in the previous slide here, right, so moving to population dynamics, which actually look into these factors and help us understand how the population of organisms change over the period of time in nature. So before I explain to you what does this actually mean, if you look into the graph here, you have brown line as predator, blue as prey, and the dotted lines, green ones, which are representing plant population. These are population sizes, okay? And what you see is over time, which is in generation. So over generation, how does the number of these different organisms keep changing, right? So you see all the lines go in a zigzag manner. And what does it say? It says that all the population experience this increase in number, decrease in number, increase in number, decrease in number, and it's a very natural process. This does happen naturally, and those are already taking place. But when does it become a problem? When this natural cycle is affected and this number is not able to, when it's basically when the population number goes down, it is not able to recover, it is not able to come up. That's when the issue comes up. And when does it happen? When there is not enough time for the populations to recover because of enhanced effects of the causes of the biodiversity loss. Right. So population dynamics, when, as a name suggests, it's about the dynamicsm, how they are moving. So what is moving? Population size is moving. So change in population size over time is population dynamics. And these population dynamics are occurring because of two type of factors: deterministic factors and stochastic factors. Now, deterministic factors are factors which are affecting on large population sizes. Stochastic, the word by the meaning of stochastic is by chance, and anything which is happening by chance to have an impact which is visible, it has to happen on a smaller population, because if it's happening on a larger population, the effect will be minimalized because there are so many. Let's just consider it as an individual. So there are many individuals, and there are some chance events. There are very few instances where you will observe it because it's a chance event and it's only happening at a smaller scale. So if the population size is large, you don't see that effect. But when the population size is too small, when you have handful of organisms and there are stochastic factors which are happening by chance, then you see the impact more prominently in such populations. So that's what. So when you have population dynamics, you have deterministic factors and you have stochastic factors. So moving on, let's look into these factors in more detail. So if you talk about deterministic factors which are acting on large population size, you have births, deaths, immigration, emigration. These are impacting how the population size will change over time. So with births, new individuals are being added. With immigration, which is movement of other organisms into the genetic pool, they are introducing more genetic diversity, and they are also increasing the number. So these are leading to increasing number. Well, these are balanced by deaths and emigration. Deaths are basically animals which are dying, and emigration are animals which are moving out from that region. So emigration and death leads to reduction in number. So you have a balance between addition and decrease in the number. And these are deterministic factors which are acting upon the changing in the population size. The other deterministic factor is the population structure. So population structure basically tells you how many males are there, how many females are there, how many reproducing females are there, how many reproducing males are there, how many animals or how many females or males are there who are not reproducing, whose age structure is very high. So this gives you an idea if the reproducing population or the reproduction bar of the population is more, that means they have more reproducing animals. So more reproducing individuals contribute more to the population growth. If there are less young reproducing animals but more of old age, then you know that there will be a skew because there will be no further addition to this population. So in this way, these are deterministic factors which act on a larger scale. But when you talk about stochastic characters, these are or stochastic factors, these are factors that play their role when the population size is too small, right? Now, what are these stochastic factors that have impact when you see them in a small population size? The first one here, as you can see on this slide, is about the demographic stochasticity, which is basically any chance event, but at a population level. Just a second. Right. So you have demographic stochasticity, which means that you can have, so these are, as I said, these are all chance events, or these are all probabilistic events. So you have occurrence of probabilistic events like reproduction, litter size, sex determination, and death. Now, what does it mean? How can reproduction be a chance event? If you have a small population, let's say you have very less population, 10 individuals, and in one of the breeding cycle, only 2 individuals reproduce. So your your next generation have very little number to begin with. So that's a chance event, and that becomes chance because you only have 10 individuals. Let's imagine this to be 1,000 individuals population, and out of this only 50 population, 50 of individuals, they reproduce. That's a problem. But when you have larger population, you are bound to expect that there will be more individuals which are also reproducing in the population, and that will bring stability to the population size. So that's about the demographics stochasticity. Now this was about reproduction. You can also have litter size variation. Now let's consider a large population size. Okay, there are 1,000 individuals, and 50 of them reproduced. Now out of the 50 reproduction, 40 or let's say 30 of them had a litter size of 7 to 8. So good population clutch. But few of them had population clutch of 2, 3 or 8, but 5 of them died, but 2 and 3. So it doesn't matter in large population size because you still have other individuals who have given birth to a good litter size. But now you bring this to a small population where you only have 10 individuals and you only have 5 individuals who are reproducing and giving birth to the next generation. Out of this, if you have a litter size of 2, it will be a problem. If you have a litter size of 8, but 5 of them die, again 3, so it will be a problematic event, and it becomes problem because it's a small population. There are no more individuals to recover from this. So these are all demographic stochastic events that can take place in a small population and can have detrimental effect. Next is environmental variations and fluctuations. So there could be environmental variations, and environmental changes can lead to death. Now in large population size, out of those 1,000 individuals, let's say 200 died, you still have 800 as your backup individuals who are surviving and who will carry on the generation. But in 10 individuals, if for 5 or if for 4 also die, it still is a problem because there are only 6 individuals that are remaining, and they might also not survive, or they might not have the best gene pool. So this becomes again more prominent in small population. Next, in small population, you have problems like genetic processes. So let's just carry on from the last example. So you have some environmental fluctuation, and 6 of them are surviving, 4 of them died. But the 6 of them who are surviving are all, they carry the same allele. So they are all homozygous for the same allele. It leads to inbreeding depression. There is loss of heterogeneity. There is more inbreeding depression because now only these are the individuals who will found the next population, and they have only one allele to represent themselves. So you have loss of genetic diversity, loss of heterogeneity, and inbreeding depression. And you can also have density dependent mortality. So as you can see in the image, there is a carrying capacity for a population. So a population can only be sustained up to a certain number, which is called the carrying capacity. And after that, the population starts dying. So if it's a large population and let's say the carrying capacity is 800, so after 800, if you have 200 individuals, those 200 individuals are at a risk of dying, right? That's okay. You have 800 individuals still. But in a small population, what if there is density dependent mortality and all the individuals are dying? It anyway started with a small population number and now there is density dependent mortality. So there is actually mortality and animals are dying. So it's basically reducing the number further. So these kind of, factors have large effect when it's in a small population. So, and that's why they are stochastic factors. Okay, now these were factors that were affecting species survival, and we have also done similar kind of factors in the previous session, which were called the hippo factors. So H was for habitat loss, I were for invasive species, P for population, P for human exploitation, and O for overexploitation. If you see hippo factors or the 5 threats of biodiversity loss that we had just discussed, basically all of them try to cover the same 5 overarching theme which mainly causes problem to the biodiversity, right? Now with all of these factors we have already been discussing that with all of these factors which are taking place as natural course, what is even more important is the human effect, the anthropogenic change which is being brought about in the recent world. And that is also causing posing as a threat to the species survival. But when does human impact pose a problem for species survival? When these sensitivity issues of the species are being, encroached upon. So if an animal is resilient, so these are sensitivity of species to human impacts. So if there is resilience by the animal to changes, then you can imagine that these kind of animals might be able to tolerate the rapid changes that are brought about by human activities a bit better than the ones who are not resilient. So a resilient animal can still survive to a certain more extent than the ones who are not resilient. Then you need to see the animals or the plants there, how much of human attention are being retained on them. Now tiger has extremely high human attention in both ways, in positive ways because they are very charismatic, in negative way also because they are also very fearful. So these animals of course are at the peak of the ones who are mostly affected by human impacts. Then ecological overlap and home range. Now these are basically so let's say home range is basically the extent where the animal moves, and when they are moving, if in the vicinity they encounter human habitation, there is of course human wildlife conflict and these impact these animal survival. Similarly, if you have ecological overlap, if you have some plantations and those plantations are being fed upon by animals, there is ecological overlap, these animals come to feed on the plantation and that leads to human wildlife conflict, and this also impact these animals at the similar level. So how sensitive are the response of species to human impact depend on these very factors. So we can, this was discussed in the lecture. This is a way of how you can assess the threat, and I'm sure you would have gone over this in the lecture. I will just explain this to you once again. So basically these are species area curve, and the idea is, so here let me first explain to you. So the formula is S is equal to C into A to the power Z. S is species richness, C is a taxonomic constant. So species by area, we are taking a constant. A is area of the land. So what we are trying to see, if we have a greater area, what is the species richness, right? And Z is for different islands. The Z is a property of the land and the property of the biological organisms that you find there. Now, the question here is, how do you assess the threat? This is talking about area and dependency of the species richness on an area. Now, what if I, reduce the area? How is that gonna impact the species richness is what the idea is, right? This is how on the right you see, this is exactly how this curve is plotted. So you have and you see the curve is saturating after a time. It means that there is a cap of species richness that can be reached even if you increase the area. So there can only be certain increase in species richness, after which it will reach a plateau form stage, which means even if you increase the area size, it doesn't matter, species richness has been reached at its maximal capacity. Now, how was this used in the lecture? What we were trying to see there was, if we reduce the area size, how much of the species diversity or species richness is being lost. And this was the example that was discussed. So your Z or Z, the factor Z in nature varies from 0.15 to 0.35. Now, if we take Z as 0.3 for area 1, this is how its species richness is supposed to be. But for some reason, the area is now been degraded by 90%, right? So 90% of the area is gone. So only 10% of the area is remaining. So the new area, which is A2, is 10% of the first one, which is 0.1 into A1, right? So the formula will be this. Now you want to see how much species richness does the second one have in comparison to the first one. So you do S2 by S1, put this in the formula, everything cuts with each other, everything gets negated except for this 0.1, which is also raised to the power 0.3. So you have 0.1 to the power 0.3, which is 0.502, which is 50%. So you can see that if your Z value is good enough, which is 0.3, and if you have a reduction of 90% area, it just leads to species richness being half. Looks good, but when you put in more math and put different scenarios, it changes. Let's see how. So this was the first one. This is what we did. In the second one, keeping the same formula, just changing the Z value. The Z value here was 0.3, which is what we have taken. Let's consider 0.5. The same formula, however, now it becomes 0.1 to the power 0.15, which is 70.8. So S2 has 70.8 of S1. So how much percent it actually lost? It lost 29.2%. So what actually changed here? The Z value, the property of the land, the how much vegetation it has and what kind of animal it has also determines if you lose a certain portion of the land, how much biodiversity are you going to lose. So this was an example that was discussed in the lecture, right? What it says, let me read by line. So it says, we have discussed about the rate percent reduction as 90%, right? Now see here, it says the rate at which tropical forests are actually decreasing is 1.8 per annum. So it's very less, minimal. And with the lowest value of Z, which is 0.15, this would translate to an annual loss of 0.27. How? By the formula on your right. So what has happened here is, you have now a land which is 1.8 times or 1.8% less than the previous one. So that is what we did in the previous slide also. So now our new area is 0.982 of the A1, first one. And we are left with this 99.72% species richness in the second area, which means there is only 0.27% reduction. So what we are trying to say, if you see the tropical forest, where you see every year 2% of the land is decreasing and the area has a Z value of 0.15, it means that only 0.27% of the biodiversity is lost. Looks okay, doesn't look very scary. When does it become scary? It becomes scary when you take into effect the number of species that are there. So the estimated number of species in tropical forest is 10 million, right? So the annual loss, if you're losing at 0.27%, you're basically losing 27,000 species per year. Now it becomes a problem, right? In numbers, it did not look a problem, but when you actually put into formula, you see you're losing 27,000 species per year. And tropical forests are rich in biodiversity. Losing 27,000 species means you could also have some species which are going extinct. And this is definitely not good. These are problematic, and these are the exact issues that we are trying to address when we are looking into conservation. Right? So with this, the first part of this module, which was threat to biodiversity, comes to an end. And I have again summarized the entire lecture into 10 questions. These are those 10 questions, and I will give you time to wait and read the question, try to attempt it, and I will come back and help you solve it and discuss the answers. Let me read out the questions for you and wait for you to come on to an answer. The first one says, which of these do not justify why larger fragments support more species? You have several options. You are supposed to think larger fragments support more species, that is given. But why do they do it? And which one of these do not fall under those reasons? Second is, which of these does not impact the sensitivity of the species to human impact? This is what we have discussed. Third is, the acronym HIPPO does not include which of the following terms. Last is, if the pack size is so small that the wild dogs cannot attack all the sambar and go hungry, this is a case of which of these processes. And the last one here is, dash is defined as the process by which the habitat quality for a species is diminished. So be careful of the key term here and try to identify the correct answer. I will wait for you on this slide and then come back maybe after 1 or 2 minutes and then discuss the answers with you. Okay, so let me give you the answers. Right. So, and let me discuss and you can analyze if you were on the correct track. So the first one is, which of these do not justify why larger fragment support more species? So larger fragment support more species because larger fragment have diverse environment. That makes the first option incorrect. Second, large size of the land, so it can support large population. Large fragments, so it can also have common and uncommon species. So when you have large population and you have one single fragment, there is less chance of you to have isolated population. So you do not have isolation population, and if there is isolated population, you don't have more species. So that's why this is the not incorrect option. Next is, which of these does not impact the sensitivity of the species to human impact? Human attention, ecological overlap, resilience, and home range. These are the four that affect. Nutritional requirement of the species comes under ecological overlap along with several other factors. Alone, it's not the only factor that, or it does not impact the insensitivity. The acronym HIPPO does not include habitat enhancement. So the first option, habitat loss, is the expansion of H. Invasive species is for I. Human overpopulation is for one of the P. The other P is pollution, and O is overexploitation. Now, fourth is, if the pack size is so less that the wild dog cannot attack or attack the sambar and go hungry, this is the case of alley effect. Now, what is alley effect? Alley effects are effects that you see in a small population on the fitness of the individual. So basically what these effects say, that if the population size go down, the fitness of the individuals in the population also go down. Here, if you see, there is no death, right? They are going hungry. They are not yet dying. So we cannot say death yet. There is no competition because they are not killing. There is no invasive species because sambar are natural prey for wild dog. But what is happening is, because the pack size is so low, they are not able to target the sambar properly. They are going hungry and their fitness is getting affected. So that's why this is a case of alley effect. And the last one is, dash is the process by which habitat quality. So whenever there is a quality problem, it is about the degradation of the habitat. So we will discuss all these four in the next chapter. But all these four concepts have their own meaning, where degradation means anything which is to do with quality. Right? Okay, moving on to the last 5 questions for this lecture. Again, I'll read out and wait for you to answer. So the first question is, which of these is not a factor determining the rarity of a species? So basically, why is rarity of a species so important? If a species is rare means you find them in less frequency, it has more chances of getting extinct or facing the threats. So what exactly determines that a species is rare is what your question is about. Next is, which of these is not a push factor? Basically, which of this does not push animal away from its habitat? Next is, which of this is a stochastic factor? So if we have discussed population dynamics, which of these factors here affect when the population size is less? And then similarly, which of this is not a deterministic factor? And the last one is, which of this is not a causal agent for habitat degradation? So if you have habitat quality being reduced, what could be the possible reason for that? So I will wait and then come back and discuss the answer for you. In the meanwhile, you can read the questions, try to understand this, and attempt it on your own. Okay, so let me give you the answers. Right. So the first one is, which of these factor is not a factor determining the rarity of a species? The answer is competitive edge. Let me explain why. So the first is evolutionary characteristics. So if an animal is, by the, has, how do I explain? Very particular food requirement that is only found in a certain region, then those are characteristics that make it rare. Then again, because of food habit, it has a limited geographical range and low population density. So it has low population, it has a limited geography. By evolution, it cannot move very further distance. So all these make it very rare. If it is competitive edge, it means it has a higher competitiveness edge. It means it can survive in different regions because of competition ability. That should actually not be rare, right? That should be very common. It should be found anywhere. But because it is not, it means it doesn't have that competitive edge over other individuals or organisms, right? Now, next is, which of this is not a push factor? So you need to understand which of this will not drive animal away from a region. So if there is no suitable environment, animal may move away. If there is competition, if there is invasive species, animals will move away from this region. So ambient weather will actually, on the contrary, let the animals stay at that location and survive there. So that's why ambient weather is actually a pull factor and not a push factor. Next, which of these is a stochastic factor? Birth rate, death rate, population structures are affecting large population sizes. Environmental fluctuation affect the small population. Next, which of these is not a deterministic factor? Birth rate, population, death rate. Again, as the upper question also says, these are stochastic. These are deterministic factors. But migration is is a stochastic factor. And it affects when the small population becomes. The population becomes too small. The next is last one. Which of these is not a causal agent for habitat degradation? So desertification basically makes the land arid. Water overexploitation makes water either go extremely dry or extremely clogged with water retention. Deforestation actually reduces the entire forest patch to just like deforested land, no vegetation. So these are actually leading to degradation of the forest patch or habitat. But when you convert a land for agriculture, you are increasing the productivity of the land. So you're not degrading the quality. But it has other associated problems that we will now see in the next lecture. But for this question, the answer is the diversion of land for agriculture does not cause habitat degradation. Right. So that brings us to an end of the first lecture of this week's. We now move to the next lecture, which is ex situ and in situ conservation. Now, these are the four images that cover the habitat related issues that we have been discussing in the last question of the previous slide. Now, there are four images on this slide, and these, of course, are talking about a habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, habitat displacement, and habitat degradation. There are four images on this slide. I would like you to first try to guess just by the word itself and imagining the definition which image would fit where. Which one is an image for habitat degradation? Which one is an image for habitat loss? Which one is for habitat fragmentation and habitat displacement? And I will wait 30 seconds so that you can think upon this, and then I will explain which one is what. Okay, let me explain these images and let's try to make sense of this. The last one here, let's start with this. So you have an owl. This is a photo, as you can imagine, after some forest fire and some deforestation activity, and an owl is now perching on a rock. So what kind of image would this be? This one, the image at the bottom says, you can look that there is a contiguous land on the extreme right, but there is this green vegetation land which is in between a patch which is surrounded by a very largely overgrazed and deforested land. So you have a patch of greenland, but it is at the middle of nowhere. This here, you can see that part of this land has been cropped off, like it has been chopped off, and then the forest has been retained. So you can imagine a large side forest land. Part of it has been chopped off and the other is being still retained. Now here you can see that the forests have been cleared off, they have been burnt off. Many of the forest part has been, like they have been deforested, burnt. So yeah, those are the first images and this is what they show. The first one shows habitat degradation because you have now literally burnt off, killed, or like you have cut the trees, you have decimated the entire landscape. Displacement here because you can now see that there is still a contiguous land vegetation there. So the animals now basically will move from this region to that region. This should be okay, right? But the problem is there are some micronutrients, microhabitat which were associated with this vegetation which has now moved to this. You can see the almost the entire vegetation has been retained, but this part has been cleared off. So what happens if you cleared off this part? Of course, the animals will have their shade lost, will have their native plants lost. So they will start moving towards the interiors or exteriors, but they will start moving to find their suitable habitat. So then they will now probably move into this bush or that region. But what will happen is there were some micronutrients here. They were here because of some region which has now been moved away. So they have to now either find a suitable place or die. Why die? Because these regions were already being occupied by other animals. So if you have new animals encroaching their region, there will be more competition and there will be more predation, and that can of course leads to more death. So that's why habitat displacement. This is habitat fragmentation and it's very easy because it has now really become just a fragment in between a largely overgrazed land. And this is habitat loss because they have lost their habitat, they have lost the trees that they were residing on. So they have now nowhere to go. So this is an image of habitat loss. So I hope you had got that right. Right. So these are human activities impact on the habitat around our nature, around for the wildlife and the vegetation. So this fragmentation that we had just seen, right? Fragmentation where you see a patch of the land is removed or it's isolated from all the other land. This doesn't become overnight. There is a constant or a gradual process of how habitat fragmentation takes place, and we will see that now. So let's go over this image. This image was already discussed in the lecture. I will just discuss this once again so that you are able to understand it better. So let's try to understand it from these images. So the first image here is of an original forest. And what does original forest mean? It basically means that you have multiple trees, many trees lining up beside each other, forming this contiguous landmass, right? Now, how does humans start impacting these forests? They start by first dissecting, this forest. And how do you do it? You basically build a road. Let's say here you have built a road in between this forest. Now this is dissection because you have just made us, you can imagine dissection is basically making a slit or cutting open a body. So you are making us like a division in between the forest. So you are doing this. Now this will come with added problems. If it is, as you would have seen in the lecture, it's a road, so you will have cars and buses and basically all the transportation moving. You will have animal movement, you will have transportation, they will collide with each other. Even if they don't collide with each other, because there is road, they will have humans. Because they have humans, it's an extended area. People will start putting up shops. With shops come small houses. With small houses comes livelihood. With livelihood comes family. With family comes sustenance, and with that comes introduction of new habitat into the forest. Now what do? You start perforating this original forest with habitat changes like you have now built a house, so you clear off part of this land. You have brought into with these human bring with them the kettles. So cattle were not there in these forests earlier. They were wild animals. Now you have cattle. So you also have brought about new animals into the forest land. So you have increased the chances of conflict, of predation, of the several attacks that could be possible. So this is what one was dissection. Now you have started perforating because you have started now adding your layers to the forest. Now what happens after this? Now you see this image here. It is just a start. Okay, you have cleared this part of the land, made house, put some farm there, put your cattle there. Now over the period of time, there will be more families coming and settling in there, and with that what will happen is you have more houses built up. So you have more of these regions which are being cleared off and being so the humans are trying to make a connectivity, and they are doing it by clearing of forest patches. This happens on either side of the road. This side also you have forest patches degraded. So you are now starting to fragment the original forest. And where is the fragmentation exactly taking place? This is where the fragmentation. You see this forest part here has started to become separate from the other forest part. There is now a good road and other barriers in between these different forest patches, and this is now started to become fragmentation. So this leads to habitat fragmentation, and then you have attrition, then you have several other attractions that keep coming to these places, and these effects keep increasing in number. So this over the period of time leads to fragmentation. Now you see this last image and you see the first image, you only have few trees here, here, and they have now been in isolated plants and they have become very fragmented from each other. So this is how you have habitat fragmentation, right? Now, before I go to conservation, this is how you have habitat fragmentation. For habitat degradation, for reducing the quality, how do you do it? We have already seen you make it a desert, you have extreme water logging, or you overexploit water, make it very dry, or you can also have contamination from pollution, air, water, land, different kind of pollution. You can have soil erosion. You can also have deforestation where you are cutting off the land, and now you are clearing off the land of vegetation, and you clear it off at a certain level that it cannot repair itself. And then you have invasive species introduction. So you basically introduce different species which is not part of the native flora and fauna, and that degrades the entire quality. So these are the different ways you have habitat degradation. This is a different way you had different habitat fragmentation. So all these are very much prevalent in the nature today, and this is being exacerbated by human activities. So we now are at a stage where we need to make a call for conservation, and we had to look into conservation because it is the need of the hour. So let's look into what is conservation. Of course, we have done this in the very first lecture. We have looked into what is conservation and what are the basic themes that we are trying to understand here. So let's look at that first and then move into the details of this chapter or lecture. So conservation, basically the word, if you break the word, it becomes con and surveyor. So con means together, surveyor is to keep. So together you are trying to upkeep or keep the the nature the way it was. So conservation is basically, if you take it together, you have preservation, protection, and restoration of natural environment and wildlife. And if you go to the first lecture, you will see that we had very clearly discussed that conservation is not similar to preservation, not to environmentalism, and not to ecology. Preservation is preserving the area the way it is. So it is allows some places and some creatures to exist without significant human interference. Environmentalism concerns with the impact of people on environmental quality. Ecology studies the relationship between organism and environment, but this is not conservation. These together is conservation. You are trying to preserve, but you also have to, include human in the process, because they have to be the one who actively take part in the processes. You're not just studying the relationship, you're also applying them to enhance the quality of living. You're not just impacting the quality of environment, you're also looking into the soil, into the water, into anywhere where you have life form. So it's not preservation, environment, ecology. Conservation is a whole domain of its own self. right? We have already discussed this. Now, anytime you talk about conservation of wildlife, the first word is it endangered? So what exactly does endangered mean and where does it come from? The word endangered or the classification of endangered comes from this IUCN Red List. So IUCN has made this list categories where it has classified animals based on the information that it has, based on the population size, based on the habitat, based on the range of the animal, into these several categories, and based on the placement of animals into these categories, they are considered for their importance in conservation programs. So the least concern, the first one here is least concern, but there's a classification before that which is data deficient. Now data deficient are animals for whom you do not have enough information on the abundance or distribution of estimate its risk of extinction. You don't have information on them. So those animals are data deficient and you cannot do anything about them. Then you have least concern. The least concern are animals whose population is stable and stable enough that it is unlikely to face extinction in the near future. So these are least concern. They do you know that they can survive for a few more years and they are currently not under any threat. Then you have near threatened. So these near threatened ones, they close to qualifying or likely to qualify for threatened category, but in the near future. Right now, they are not threatened, but they have some threats which are impacting their population number and their survivability. Next, you have vulnerable. Vulnerable are the ones which have high risk of extinction in the wild, right? And then you have endangered, which have very high. So you see, the classifications are based on high, very high, these kind of divisions. So endangered have very high risk of extinction in the wild. Critically endangered, they face extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. And then you have two categories which are of animals which are extinct. You have EW, which are extinct in the wild. So extinct in the wild are basically animals who are known to only survive in captive feeding or captivity. You don't find them in the wild at all. No, for national parks or no biodiversity reserve, you don't find these animals there. So they're extinct in the wild. They're only found in captivity because human intervention have preserved them, right? And lastly, are extinct are animals who are now who have been washed off from the face of the earth. You do not find any individual, even the last individuals has died. So these are the 7 categories of IUCN Red List where the animals are classified, and these, the ones who are the threatened category, they are the ones who are prioritized for conservation programs, right? So, and in these animals, again, you have several classification based on what you decide whether to go ahead with the species or not. What are these classifications? The first is flagship species. As the name suggests, these are species chosen to represent an environmental cause such as ecosystem in need of conservation. As the name suggests, flagship, so they are basically flag-bearing species, and they are very charismatic. So they catch high eye of the humans, right? For example, panda or tiger or lion. They're very charismatic, right? So you animals or humans tend to feel, oh, these are very catch it why they are very popular. They have this, they have that. So if you conserve those animals, then you have more chance of humans understanding the need for conservation. In contrast, if you take an animal which is not really interesting to humans, so those become a bit problematic to conserve because you don't have as much public interest in them. So the next one is keystone species. These are species whose addition or loss from an ecosystem leads to major changes in the occurrence of at least one of the species. So keystone are basically the major part of any, you can say, structure. So these are very important for ecosystem, and they have very important role, and we will see in the next slide how these are very important species, and they bear the burden of carrying the ecosystem functionality. Next, you have indicator species. We know mosses, we know lichens who indicate certain fact or certain features about the, let's say, environment or certain features about other set of species. And then you have umbrella species, which is one of the most important. These are wide-ranging species whose requirement include those of many other species. So protection of umbrella species automatically extends protection to other species. So you will think that, umbrella species is basically, let's say, animals which have large home range. So they are moving from this area to that area, which is very large in extent. And if you want to conserve these kind of animal, of course, you want to conserve that much area, because of course if you don't put their home range into consideration, how will that animal survive by moving ahead? Now if it is moving in such a large extent, there are many animals that will also come in that part of the land, and they will automatically be protected because of the same features that we are applying for the umbrella species. So umbrella species protection is one of the as I said, it is definitely one of the most important features. But that does not mean that keystone are not important, because if you might have an umbrella species but the keystone organism is not there, that might lead to the disruption in the ecosystem stability, right? So this is what is keystone species. So for example, you have mountain lion. Why is it a keystone species? This lion can kill lion kills, they support bears emerging from hibernation, food basically. Their carcass enrich soil, supporting plant and invertebrates. You have migrating birds that depend on their carcass. So you have that an animal is giving up so much of benefit for other animals, for the ecosystem. So that's why it's an keystone species. You have umbrella species, as this name suggests. If you want to attempt to conserve these birds here, you will automatically conserve these other animals because they are part of the large home extent or home range that they have. And these are flagship. You say anyone giant panda, they're very much interested into looking into what a panda does, how does a panda eat, how does the panda move. Polar bear, they're so attractive because they're part of a land which is not really habitable by human. Tiger, I don't think so in this country. I need to speak about tiger much. Tiger is everywhere. Tiger is being spoken about in every part of our country. Sea turtles, if you are a person who loves sea, who loves ocean, you will be very attracted to look into the sea turtle migration. You will be very attracted to see them moving on to the beaches and then going back into their ocean. You have manatee, which are very weird looking animals, and they also attract many human attention. Similarly, you have elephant, bald eagle, black rhino, gorilla, golden lantern. These are all flagship species because they attract human attention. And if you want to conserve them, you can imagine the interest public will have towards these conservation programs. So that's why when we are trying to identify species for conservation, we have to think on multiple species. And if a species classifies as flagship, keystone, and umbrella, that's probably the best species to go ahead because they fulfill all the criteria. And one such animal which was discussed in the lecture was tiger. Right. Now, we have all decided, let's say, which animal or which species to conserve. Now, how do you go ahead with the entire conservation process? First thing is we do population viability test. Now, what you see here is basically a process by which the extinction probability of a single species population is assessed by integrating data on life history, demography, genetics of the species, along with information on the variability of environment. So now we are actually starting to integrating the population biology, animal biology, environmental factors, all the factors that we have read till now, all the study together will tell if this is the present condition. You can see here, this is the effect that we are trying to measure, and we are trying to look into the extinction probability. And this here is the number of individual for starting. So we are trying to say what is the probability of extinction given this effect and given this number of population. See, if you start with two number, you see the population extinction probability reaches 1 within very less time. But if you have 64, that same thing takes a longer time. So you can increase the number of sizes and delay the effect of extinction. So these kind of analysis let you know what number to begin with, how much number is sustainable number to go ahead in a conservation program. Now, so you have decided your species, you have decided the procedure. Now, what do you do? Which method do you go for? So how are the methods distributed? You have two kinds of conservation in general. You have in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. As the name suggests, they are in situ, so they are basically in the place. Ex situ is basically they are outside the place. What place are we talking about here? We're talking about the habitat of the organism. So in situ, national park, wildlife sanctuaries, biosphere reserve, and sacred groves. Here, the animals are not moved from their original location. They are retained in their original habitat and they are conserved there. Ex situ, you have zoological parks, you have botanical gardens, gene banks, and cryopreservation. These animals here or plants, they are moved out of their natural habitat into a safeguarded environment, and that is where their conservation takes place. Let's look into their advantages and disadvantages individually. So in situ conservation, which is basically where the animal is present, you are trying to conserve it right there. So what does this mean? So you have ecological monitoring and the intervention which have been done in the natural habitat, and you have, of course, legislation takes place for any of these conservation. Now what are the advantages? Very intuitive to understand. Advantage: species continue to live in the natural environment, so species don't experience any sudden shock. Less disruptive, less costly, because you're not putting any new you can say you know facilities. Everything is in natural condition. You're just using that. Now that patch is now just being designated for conservation. You have natural behaviors to be maintained because it's a natural environment. You have protection on natural habitat, and as because of that, you provide protection to other species. Just takes care of the entire umbrella species concept. Even in case of ex situ conservation, the animal will need to be released somewhere, but in situ, this release step where you have grown animal, you have kept them in captivity, now you want to release them back into the wild, that is not required in situ because they're already in their natural environment. And lastly, reserves double as places for scientific studies and public awareness. You do know that national parks and biosphere reserve are open to public. They are allowed to go there. They are allowed to see the animals in their natural habitat and environment, and that also creates awareness. But then it also comes with its disadvantage. What are the disadvantage? For putting an area of national park or biosphere reserve level, you need very high region, very large area. That is difficult to find. Less intensive protection and management because areas will be encroached upon, animals can be poached. How? When I said that this is open to public, it means it is open to the natural or the native people also, and there are so many poaching cases that you must be aware of. And because there is such a large area that needs to be protected, these kind of problems keep coming up. Next, you have threat of disease and disaster. That's because you have a large area, and if there is an outbreak, you don't know where it started and how to control it. If you contrast it to a small area, which is in case of captive breeding, and you know that there has been an outbreak of certain disease in the captive animals, you know when to stop and where to look forward to. But not in these cases of in situ conservation. And again, large establishment, as was discussed in the first time. So in situ comes with its own advantage and disadvantage. Now, because we have discussed in situ, we should also discuss ex situ quickly. So ex situ is basically, you have to first designate a part, okay, that this is the animal that I want to conserve, but now I don't want to conserve it in its natural environment. I want to take it to, let's say, zoo, or plant. If it's a plant, I want to take it to a botanical garden, and I want to create conditions such that these animals or plants survive much, much better. And these animals are critically endangered ones whose, habitat had been highly degraded. So these animals now need human intervention, and they are taken to a new suitable environment, and which are created artificially by humans, right? What are the advantages that you can think of? Of course, you have better control of everything that you are trying to do here. You can control for variables such that climate is controlled, there is no disease, what kind of food they are eating, what kind of other features, like what kind of timings that they have for exposure to outside. So all these can be controlled. Provide opportunity for close observation for better understanding of species and the proximate cause of it. That's what I said. You let them out in the wild, you observe them, you know what is happening to them exactly. And it permits intensive intervention, for example, in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer. So, you are trying to conserve them, you're trying to preserve them. At the same time, you're also trying to increase their population size. So in vitro fertilization, embryo transfer are all methods that are used to facilitate hybridization, breeding programs to increase the population sizes. Okay, but as you can imagine, disadvantages are very intuitive. First is they do not prevent loss of habitat because if you have removed animal, it doesn't mean that the habitat that is left behind will recover its loss. Okay. Second, it can be only done for few species. Otherwise, you need a very large area, and again, the same large area problems will come. Wild behaviors will be lost because if you don't, even if you let them out, say you have made an encroachment which looks like they're wild, it is still not their natural environment. So some of the wild behavior, some of their natural instinct will be lost. Right? Captive bred animals and raised individuals find it difficult when reintroduced, which is a problem because they have been grown in external environments, and they may increase chance of inbreeding if not planned properly. That is exactly why you have in vitro fertilizer and embryo transfer. You try to breed individuals from distinct locations so that they don't have inbreeding depression, and of course that makes it all the more costly. So this is costlier, in situ is less costlier, but you can see advantage and disadvantage go hand in hand for both of these programs. So again, when you are talking about what exactly to prioritize and what animals to go ahead, you have several criteria to decide. We already saw that what kind of animals are there, what kind of conservation methods are there. These are other such features. First is biodiversity hotspots. So you're basically trying to see if the region or the animals have high species richness, high species endemism, or high number of species under threat. So these are the ones which get more priority over the other species. You have threat triage, so you can have threats like, or you can assess the threat and see if they have very high threat, if you have medium or very low. And amongst this, the one which have medium threat, they are the one who are preferred or who are prioritized for conservation. Very understandingly so, because if you see they have very high threat, it means they have already experienced the threat at a very maximum level. They might not be able to recover even if you have extreme human intervention. Very low is what exactly is in the near threatened and vulnerable population. You can look into, you can closely monitor them, but you don't need to prioritize them for conservation. There are other animals which are the ones which are facing medium level of threats, whom the focus is on, because if you focus and prioritize them, then you remove the threats, you conserve these animals, right? And the other thing is gap analysis, where, like I said, you monitor the entire situation and you're trying to identify holes in the existing network or protected areas, and how, so you can imagine, right? What, let's say there is a region where you have animals who are currently endangered. Try to understand why they are endangered. Is it because they are not connected properly? Their habitat is not connected. If that's not the issue, is it because they are diseased individuals? Is it because their number is decreasing because of environmental fluctuation? Is it because, so you try to understand the reason for that problem and then try to address them. So if you do that, you know which one organism and which kind of intervention you should take for the conservation program. So that's brings us to the end of this lecture, and I have summarized the lecture like I always do in set of 10 questions which try to cover all the aspects of the chapter. And I will, as always, because I want you to read the question, try to understand what kind of questions can come in the exams. I would like you to read the questions, try to understand and try to answer it on your behalf, and of course I'll come back and give you the answer, but I will read out the questions in case it doesn't make sense. So the first question here is, dash play critical role, ecological roles that are of greater importance than we would predict for their abundance. So even if they are lesser in number, but they play very, very important role in ecology. Which kind of species are them? Next is, which of these is not a scientific way of creating reserve? So if we are trying to create a biosphere reserve or any of these conservation reserve, what does not is not the correct way to determine where and how to make the reserve? Next is captive breeding. If I'm saying captive breeding, which kind of method is that? Next is, which of these is not a disadvantage for ex situ? We have discussed the ex situ disadvantages. What do you think is not a disadvantage? And lastly, the tiger has a home range of several square kilometers. It regulates the ecosystem through controlling herbivore population and through trophic cascades. And people come to tiger reserve to watch tigers. Then what is tiger actually here? which kind of species is this. So I'll wait for few minutes and I'll come back and discuss all the answers. In the meanwhile, please read the question, think on the answers and see if you got it right. Okay, so let me give you the answers. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the first one is, oh, yeah, sure. I'll just look into your answers and then come back and, so just a second. C and D. Okay. Maybe I'll wait for 2 more seconds so that you can answer and then I can come back and discuss the answers. Okay, so let me give you the answers. I'll just check this box. CC, so CD, CCD. Okay. So here are the answers. So the first one is dash play critical ecological role, as you've got right. It's keystone species and we have discussed it already. Next is which is not a scientific way of creating reserve. So high species richness, high number of species under threat and high endemism is what we have used. So I'll just go back to the slide maybe so that you can see. So these are the three criteria for selecting a reserve: richness, endemism and species under threat. Not the species diversity of that region, because you're not looking at the region but you're also looking at the other features of the species. So the diversity, richness is a better indicator of the species diversity than just species diversity. And then you said captive breeding, it's actually ex situ first of all, so you're taking it out of the region. So ex situ conservation. Next is, so we have already discussed the disadvantages of ex situ conservation. Better control of environmental variable is a positive factor of ex situ conservation because you can control all the variables. So this is an advantage, but loss of habitat, loss of wildlife behavior and leading to inbreeding depression or inbreeding is actually the problems of ex situ conservation. And lastly, as you've guessed it right, tiger has large square kilometers. It can be an umbrella species. It regulates the herbivore population, so it's a keystone species, and it attracts people when it is in the reserves, so people can come and watch tiger. And what does it actually do when you have individuals coming to the reserve? It increases the the profit, the money for the reserve, and with that money you actually take care of all the facilities. So if you have tigers, you have this charismatic species in the reserves, you have more tourists, you have more visitors, and with that you raise more money. And if you have more money, then you put it into the same like the same use that why you had created the entire conservation reserve. So that's why they are flagship, that's why they are very important. So tiger falls into all these categories, so they are all the above. So you got that right. Okay, and the last set of 5 questions, which are again on the same lines, should not be very difficult. Let me read out the questions and then wait for your answers. So the first one is, which of these correctly represent the process of habitat fragmentation loss? So as I mentioned, any habitat fragmentation that you see does not happen over a period of few days or few months. There is a gradual process to it. Next is less disruptive and less costly. So these are 2 features, and these are advantages of which of these features, right? Which of these methods? Next is people come to Sesa Orchid Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh to witness orchids. Which is this context will be classified. So you don't have to know what are these, where are these, but read the sentence and try to make sense what kind of species are we talking about here. Next is CZA oversees and manages which of these ex situ conservation facilities. So I did not give the full form because in the full form you have the answer. So try to remember CZA was discussed in the lecture. Why was it discussed and in what terms? For respect for what. And the last is which of these does not fall under area with very high level of threat. So we have seen areas that can fall under high level of threat. I have given you these options. Which one do you think does not fall under category of threats, right? And again, I will wait for a few minutes maybe and we'll quickly look at the answers. Right, so coming to the answers for this section. So the first question was, which of these is the correct order of habitat fragmentation and loss? And we have seen that original forest, then dissection, then perforation, then fragmentation and attrition is the correct order of sequence. Next, we have less disruptive and less costly are advantages associated with in situ conservation, right? Because they are not disruptive and they are very less costly as compared to the setting up cost of an ex situ conservation. Next is people come to Sessa Orchid Sanctuary in Arunachal to witness orchids. So if humans are coming to witness something, it's a flagship species. Next is Central Zoo Authority. CZA is Central Zoo Authority, and as the name suggests, they oversee everything which is related to zoo. So anytime there is a conservation program which is to be led in a zoo, the permissions have to be taken from the CZA, and they have their own directives and principles and guidelines on how to rear an animal, how to go ahead with the entire conservation program. Lastly, which of these does not fall under area with high level of threat? So area with degradation, area with habitat loss, area of habitat fragmentation are areas where you have high level of threat. Isolated islands lead to a small paradigm problem, but they are not high level of threat as such, right? So with that, let me just quickly come to the last chapter or last lecture from this week, which is benefits from conservation. Now here we are going to actually look into how are we going to design a reserve or design a bio conservation approach that we are taking, right? There are several principles of how do you design a reserve, what kind of features should you take care of, and why should you take care of, right? So the first principle is a big reserve is better than a small reserve. And as you can see on the image, this is a bigger reserve, this is a smaller reserve. Let me read out the points on the slide and you try to see if that makes sense to you. So a bigger reserve will have more number of habitats, and if it has a high number of habitat, it has high species diversity, large populations, and those are less susceptible to extinction. All are population related parameters that we have already discussed. Then if you have a larger reserve, they are more secure and easier to manage per unit area than if you have a smaller, because that's the entire chunk together. They are less vulnerable to catastrophes because they have large buffer zones to mitigate the issue. And they have small perimeter per unit area, leading to less cost of protection. So you also look into the cost perspective, and big reserves have less cost of protection. So if you divide it into perimeter per unit area, you will see that the bigger ones have less cost, right? The next principle is one big is better than several same so small or the same total area. So let's try to fit into this 4 area into this bigger circle. But even if you put that, the bigger ones are better than these small 4 ones, because the benefit to cost ratio or the cost to benefit ratio will be less for a big reserve, as we have just seen. And here, because they are 4 isolated patches, the organisms have to move, have to be in contact with each other. All those problems are circumvented when you are having a big reserve. Next, closer reserves minimize isolation. This is very intuitive. I don't think so this is very any problem, because if the reserves, if you cannot make a big reserve, if there are small reserves, you need to ensure that they are close enough to each other so that animals start moving from one region to another. The population do not become small population. They are all meta population. Basically, all these populations are freely interbreeding and intermingling with each other, and that only will foster genetic diversity, and it will not lead to any inbreeding or inbreeding depression and isolated population that can lead to extinction. You also have cluster, which permits more movement than linear. Now, why is that? If you have this kind of cluster, you have animals which can move from here to here or here to here, then it can move from here to there. But here, the choices of the animals is very limited. If you have a linear, it can only move to this patch, it can only move to this patch. But when you put it here, it can move in any patch and in any direction, right? Okay. Next one is circular reserves has less biotic pressure, and this is in context of zone of influence, which again is in context of poaching. Now, zone of influence is basically the region where you have these biotic pressures. What are biotic pressures? You have, let's say, example of poaching. So poachers enter. For poachers to enter from this periphery is easier, and they can reach the center quite quickly because they just have to breach this wall here. But when you have a larger circular reserve, this is the center of the reserve. For the poacher to enter from this region and then move into the circle center is difficult, and that's why you have less biotic pressure in a circular reserve as compared to a linear standing reserve. Okay. Next one is connection is more important. Again, very intuitive. It's because you want to permit animals moving from one location to another without having any breakage in the or between the two populations, right? Right. Now, all these are about biosphere reserves. But one question that will definitely pop up at the very beginning is, why are we even caring about this? All of this looks like us putting all the effort, us putting all the money. What are actually we are getting in return of all of this? And to that, you have benefits from conservation. This is the entire lecture here. And all these benefits that we get, they are collectively called ecosystem service because everything is coming from ecosystem, right? Now, these ecosystem services are of different kinds and of different types. And these are equally important for us to know them, because only then when we know that what are these ecosystem actually doing for us, we understand the value of this, and that gives us more, more stronger reason to undergo or to undertake conservation practices. So in ecosystem service also, you have different kind of services that they provide to us. So first is, as you can see, provisioning services. Now, what are these provisioning services? These are direct products that you can get from the nature. What are they? First is food, right? So you can see you have many vegetables, many fruits, many different kind of meats, many different kind of processed food, for example milk, for example cheese. All these are from natural products and they are all found in nature, right? Then you have raw materials like timber, wood, or fuel. So all these are used for other purposes. Like, you also have these medicinal uh, plants giving off the medicinal resources. For example, turmeric has medicinal properties, thyme has medicinal properties, clove, dill, rosemary, they are all important medicinal resources, and they are all coming from nature. That's not just about it. You also have provisioning services in the form of genetic resources. We all know about BT crops, BT brinjal, BT cotton. What are these? These are Bacillus thuringiensis. These are natural products which are now used in crop improvement strategies. How you can make the crops pest resistant and insect resistant. All these come from natural phenomena which you observe in nature. That's why retention and preserving nature is very important. Then you have these energies which are not renewable energy, solar, wind. So all these hydro power. So all these are, as you know, much more sustainable and affordable means as compared to the other means of energy that are currently in use. Right. So that is about provisional services. Then you come to regulating. So that is not just the food that we get or the product that we get. That is not the only importance of ecosystem. What else is important? The regulating services. What are these regulating services? They are basically what kind of functions or properties the nature have that help in regulate the environment around us. Let's see one of them. For example, carbon sequestration. So we have read this, we have looked into this in the previous sessions, right? Carbon sequestration basically pulls carbon from the environment into the earth, and then they store carbon in different forms. That's because you're trying to reduce carbon from the nature, which is actually the causing factor of global warming. So nature in its own is capable of sequestering carbon, and that's exactly why we need to foster the conservation practice idea. Then you have climate regulation that I am pretty sure it's already hardbound in your Right? Because we have discussed it so many times that plants are so important for regulating the Earth's environment. Then you have biological control of pest population through predation. So any kind of predation that you see is actually a way of controlling the population of pests, preys, and other kind of forms, which are natural ways of controlling the for example, pest. So if there is an increase in the pest population, you have more problems and diseases to the plant. But if you have natural predators of these pests, the pests are kept in check. Similarly, you have some detrivores or some animals which feed on toxic waste and toxins. So they detoxify the waste, they decompose the waste, and as a result, they clean up the environment. So they have so many other features in regulating. Along with this, there are features like bioremediation. So you have breakdown of um, entities because of animals, insects, many microbes. You have purification of air and water. So many regulating services that are provided by the ecosystem. But that's not only about it. You have many supporting service. These are also very kind of important for humans, but you also have some other features which are not directly influencing humans, but they are very important. For example, supporting service are like soil formation that we have discussed in the previous lesson. You have nutrient cycling, which is again very important. You have pollination, which is giving rise to all the different kind of flowers and plants that you see around you, and those flowers have their own importance. And then you also have the provision of habitat. They are, all these different ecosystem provide habitat for different kind of diversity, thriving of different kind of diversity, right? And of course, anywhere where you have diversity, anywhere where you have plant, they are responsible for oxygen generation, which is again being used by the humans. Next, you have cultural services. So, for example, recreational. So, you have ecotourism. So, ecotourism is a kind of, retreat where people go into these natural environment, and that's also serving as a pool of or a method of earning money. So ecotourism. Then you have research, which is also providing money. You have these religious and spiritual aspect to the ecosystem. Then you have ecotherapy. You have science and educational excursions, and then you also have some some features which also provide remuneration. For example, painting of, let's say, nature is very highly respected, and that also is a source of livelihood. So you can see how different you can connect the importance of ecosystem in different spheres in different ways. So this was all about in words, but you can also put it in money, and that's by this method, which is called invest model. Now, what does this model use for? This is basically you are trying to evaluate the ecosystem services which are being provided. Now, here invest means integrated valuation of ecosystem service and their trade-offs. And what do you do exactly in this? These are basically GIS based suite of open source software, and they are used for mapping and doing valuation of explicit data and model. Basically, in very short term, you're trying to understand from the past, from using studies, from using their habitat, from using their use already, which is being in the practice. You're trying to make use of estimate of how much of the resources are being generated, how much are being used, how much money do we have, how much money can we get. So all these in terms of valuation. We will make it becomes more clearer as we go ahead in the slides. So you do valuation of ecosystem. How do you exactly do it? So as discussed in the lecture also, if you are putting up any ecosystem service, you have several things that you need to consider. For example, employment generation. How many men do you need? How many days they are working? How many wage rate they do have? Why do you need employment? You need employment because of fishing, because of, even if you have a normal farm, you need farmers, you need people who are cleaning their places. So you, how much of the money are you spending on them? Then you have, and how do you reap that money back? You have fishing. So how much production and what is the market price? Similarly, you have fuel, wood, fodder. All these are production aspects, and how, what are the market price? How much money are you getting back from these products? Then you have soil conservation and sediment. What kind of money do they give? You are trying to see if you're trying to avoid erosion, what kind of features are you applying and what kind of cost would that be? So you have different values to that as well. Similarly, you have values to nutrients that are being retained. What kind of nutrients are being retained, and do you want it to be used via fertilizers, or then you have fertilizer money. So at every step, whatever you are doing, it has a money associated with it. For example, gene pool benefits such as resilience of ecosystem and avenues for future use of biological product, which is what we have just looked at. Biological compounds are being used for several kind of application based methodology, but you need to first understand how to make harvest them, how to use them. All those steps have their own money associated. Carbon sequestration benefits, but how do you understand them in terms of money? You look into the sequestration that has been done and what kind of market price do you have for them. So market pricing on all of these features is what is determining the cost of the services that are provided by ecosystem, right? Then you can have valuation for habitats that are for different species benefits, and then these are used by so you compute habitat use benefits by benefit transfer method. Now what it means is sometimes you are not exactly the one who are doing the evaluation. Like you are not the one who are putting the money and you're trying to see how much money is coming back by doing all those calculations. What you try to do is someone else has done this based on some other properties. You try to match the properties and take information from there and see if your system also matches up to that level, then what kind of benefits do you get, right? And similarly, you have contingent evaluation method for cultural heritage, which is what, for example, like, so culturally, let's say there is a plant or a tree which is very important and you need somehow to remove people from those regions. You want to give them compensation. So you ask them, if you are associated with this plant and I'm going to remove this tree, or I want to conserve this tree and I want you people to move out, what kind of compensation do you want? So there you are not using any prior information, but the way you're evaluating is very different. It's based on the people's choices of what kind of pricing they are going to put on to the services. Then you have very many, then you have recreation benefits, air quality. So all of these are different services that are provided by ecosystem. For some, you calculate the value by doing direct evaluation. For some, you use benefit transfer method. For some, you use contingent evaluation method. Right. And with that, it brings us to the end of today's session with these last 10 questions. So as again, I will read the questions out for you, wait for some time and then come back and discuss the answer. So the first one here is, which of these is not a correct principle of reserve design? So which of these options is not one of the principles that are used for designing of a reserve? Next is, which of these is not a provisioning service? So provisioning is basically you get products out of it, or they provision some kind of requirements or fulfillments. So which of these is not falling in that category? Religious benefits are examples of which kind of service? Which of these explain why we need more plants instead of a plantation for conservation? Try to answer this and then I will come and explain to you what exactly are we trying to talk about here. And lastly, nutrient cycling is an example of which kind of service. So take your time, look into it, and then I'll come back and help you solve it. Right. So let me give you the answers. So the first one is, which of these is not a correct principle? So circular reserves and more biopressure is the wrong one, because we have discussed this in terms of the zone of influence and we have seen how the circular reserves have less zone of influence as compared to the linear one. The other three are correct. You need a big reserve, which is better than smaller one. You want a cluster, then a linear arrangement of the reserve, and you want them to be connected. Next is, which of these is a provisioning service? Honey, hydropower, comp improvement these are directly used for provisioning services. Waste decomposition is rather a regulating kind of service, right? Okay. Next, you have religious benefits are example of cultural service that we have discussed already. Which of these explain why we need more plantation instead of a more plants instead of a plantation for conservation, it is portfolio effect. And this is an important principle for conservation, where you don't want only one kind of plant in your conservation or your reserve. That's because of two reasons. One is redundancy hypothesis. Now, what is redundancy hypothesis says that if you have more kind of plants, it leads to more stability of the ecosystem. Isn't that true? If you have different kind of plants that support different kind of organism, then you have more stability to the ecosystem. So that's one of the hypotheses for why you need more plants. The other is portfolio effect, which says diversification minimizes the volatility of the investment. I'll explain why. Let's say you have a plantation and then you have a disease, or you have a forest fire, and the plantation is entirely gone because all of these are same kind of plant on the contrary. So if you have one disease or if you have one predator, everything goes away together. So whatever we had invested while making the reserve is totally lost. Instead of that, if you put different kind of plants and you have one disease for one kind of plant, you still have other plants that can recover the money that you have invested. So that's why that's for the portfolio effect. So portfolio effect and redundancy hypothesis together explain why we need more plants in for a conservation program. And lastly, nutrient cycling is an example of supportive service. Right, that brings us to the end of today's session with these 5 questions. Here we have the cultural heritage benefits can be computed using which of these method. Supply of medicine is an example of which kind of service. Kakreta facility in the city of Agra addresses which ecosystem service. You have all the 4 examples in the lecture. Try to remember where you have studied about Kakreta facility. Next is the cost of impacts caused by emission of carbon dioxide. This is an example, or this is known as what? And biological control of pest population through predation is an example of what kind of service. Right, so let me give you the answers. Right, so the first one is the cultural heritage benefit, as we have already discussed. It can be computed using contingent valuation method. Next is supply of medicine is a provisional service because it's a direct product. Kakreta facility in the city of Agra is providing sewage treatment ecosystem service. The other ecosystem service, which are water purification, as discussed in the lecture, you will see water purification is being provided by Catskill Mountains. Artificial pollination is there are reserves or facilities made for this, especially in Israel. And you have tsunami protection or mangrove forests which are built in Orissa. Okay, now why are we even talking about this? What is the importance of this? Let me bring in the perspective here. Why is this even being talked about here? Now see the first one, water purification. For this in Israel, you have made, not in India, in Catskill Mountains, you have made the designs and the reserves for that water purification can take place. But wetlands do the same thing by their own. So if you conserve wetlands, then you don't have to make this facility use. Similarly, artificial pollination, which has been done in Israel because the pollinators have reduced in numbers. The same thing can be done if you try to conserve the pollinators, which are honeybees, right? So if you try to conserve the honeybee number, then you don't have to create any more artificial pollination strategies. Similarly, tsunami protection, you don't have to make any facilities. If you try to conserve or you try to enhance the mangrove forest. And for sewage treatment, you don't need any facilities if you have forests, which are, as we have discussed also, that you have several insects, several animals which feed on the bio-waste, right? Next is the cost of impacts caused by emission of carbon dioxide is called the social cost of carbon. And the last is where you have control of pest population, that is a regulating service, and that we have also discussed in the slides today. So with that, today's session comes to an end and we see each other in the next session. Thank you.